We're at FailFest 2014. We're continuing our speaker interviews here. We have a fantastic series of speakers so far, and we've just received Mike Langellier. Thank you so much. He's CEO of TechPoint. That's an innovative tech growth organization for Indiana. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Happy to.
So what do you think about the series of speakers so far today?
I think they've been great. I think it's an important topic that is, you kind of have to create a safe space like this to be able to talk about and get some of these honest conversations that don't oftentimes, aren't very often talked about, because a lot of times they're not people's proudest moments.
Right.
But there are a lot of lessons to be learned, and ultimately we need to groom, as we're helping to groom more effective entrepreneurs. Part of that is embracing the opportunity that a failure could happen, but also learning from folks that have had failure in the past and figuring out how you can mitigate or more quickly identify that risk of failure in the future, so you don't repeat the same steps that they did.
Absolutely, and what's really unique is we're seeing these launch pad type of ecosystems, mini ecosystems of groups of people in regions across the state. There's 20 odd different places where there's groups getting together and sharing experience, and they have panels of mentors giving that feedback back. And it's an incredible thing to witness, and it's very novel for the Midwest.
Yeah.
In your experience, and TechPoint has a lot of involvement in entrepreneurs and small, medium-sized businesses here in Indiana. Are you seeing that there's a change of perspective when it comes down to appreciating failure, or learning from failure? Because, I mean, being in the Midwest, there's been a bit of for the longest time, a conservative perspective of maybe not really sharing as much of that with even another colleague business.
Yeah.
Well,
it's hard when you have the mentality of, if you're ingrained in the culture of working for a large company, and that being your career path, that you're going to be there for a long duration of time, and you're going to make a career inside that company. Failure is a really scary thing, but in the context of starting companies and growing companies and this different environment that we live and work in now, where people are changing jobs more actively, jumping in to start startup companies, and the barriers are lower to doing so.
Right.
It is something that we really need to kind of embrace and talk about. And I think that there have been folks, I think Chris Baggett was one of the folks that talked earlier in the day, and folks like that have learned a tremendous amount from an episode of failure, and then gone on to just incredible success. That helps to kind of warm the water for folks that may have been a little bit more leery to jump in and talk about this more openly.
Absolutely. It's almost in a lot of different stories. Had that failure not been there, then the success would not be there as well.
Yeah.
So there certainly is a culture of appreciation now more than ever, and I'm certainly excited to see that happen with a lot of these companies. Can you give us some personal examples of some failures in business that have taught you an extreme lesson?
So I started a startup. I've worked for 4 different tech companies, from large global company to a startup company that we started and sold about 3 years ago. And we had 2 different potential approaches to go to market. It was a personal finance and banking software application. So think Mint.com or Quicken kind of product that was online. And we said we could go direct to consumer, or we could go to kind of B2B, sell to banks and credit unions.
Sure.
And we came out with sort of this dual model, and we tested the consumer. And we kind of went with that one first because we wanted to determine if this was going to be right. But this was in the era of Mint.com was kind of the darling at the time, and it was a free application. And so competing against that, we learned that consumer model was a failure. That was the consumer acquisition cost. And the long-term value of that customer relationship, we're just not going to sustain that business model. So we ended up having to cut that approach and then go toward a B2B model of selling directly to banks and credit unions, and that ultimately was a model that made a lot more sense. But we had to kind of fail first in order to determine what wasn't going to work, so that then we could redouble our efforts in the right direction. So And that you learn a lot through that process. I learned a lot through that process about, I think, fundamentally on the consumer side, when you're starting a company, you're setting out to solve a problem, but there's some of these problems that you have to approach in the right way, and you don't want to care more about solving the problem than the customer that you're selling to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, we were endeavoring to significantly help consumers better understand their financial life and make better financial decisions. But one of the things that we learned along the way is that particularly when it comes to finances, consumers only want to grapple with it so much. And so it became a point, one of the challenges outside of kind of just the financial model challenges is that we had to kind of grapple with the reality that there are a lot of consumers that, even though that is a chronic problem for them and one that they know they need to solve, they don't, a lot of cases, they don't really want to deal with it. Mm-hmm. And it can very easily, we found ourselves in situations sometimes sort of caring more about solving that problem for them than they cared about solving it for themselves. And that's a problem. Yeah. And that ultimately, that's another one of those things that caused us to kind of pivot the business model.
We're hearing a lot of that through our conversations. We've heard, what they expected to have happen really wasn't there whenever they got there. Right. So, you do need to have obviously a vision of the target, but also have fluidity to be able to adjust differently. So, do you have a checklist of things that you go through now to be able to see whether a decision is a fail potential, or if there's a particular needle that goes a little bit too far?
Yeah, I think the view is a lot clearer now after having gone through it, and right. I think regardless of whether success or failure, you learn a lot. You learn a lot about what the steps should be in the pursuit of a startup success. Yep. And so now, in retrospect, I look back and I'm much more formulaic about the process and sort of understanding how large is the addressable market, mm-hmm. How difficult is it to get to that customer, and how costly is it? A lot of times it's very easy for somebody to jump into a startup as a passion project. It's something that they personally, they want to build this thing and they want to see it happen, but you can get so personally attached to it that you can end up in a scenario where you're in a maybe moderately successful business or a failure, and maybe one that had you to do it over again, you wouldn't have gone into it in the first place. Right. And so I think that one of the lessons learned from me was just now being able to approach a problem and a potential startup opportunity and be much more emotionally detached from it, mm-hmm. and say, does this make sense? Like from a financial perspective, and in walking into this as I would an investor, is this a business problem that it makes sense and that now is the right time to solve?
You got to run the numbers, and you can't. You need that emotion there for passion's sake.
Totally.
To be able to put that 10,000 hours in that you need to do, mm-hmm. but at the same time, you've got to have at least the sense to be able to see that you got to respect the numbers, and if the marketing's not there, if the market's not there, you just can't go full throttle, because you're going to fall over yourself. And on top of that, the emotional connection that you have to that engagement, mm-hmm. Can also shade things over as well. Right. Well, we certainly appreciate time talking to you. We'd love to talk to you again in the future. Last thought for an entrepreneur that's starting their venture, mm-hmm. or may have not had that failure yet, but what can you give them as a point of guidance?
I think that this is. I'm the CEO of TechPoint, but I think that, so it's going to sound biased, but I genuinely would say get involved in organizations like TechPoint. Yep. And that can be as easy as subscribing.
You're right, that did sound a little bit biased.
It does. But the purpose of the organization, in large part, is to help to connect the community and help to nurture these startups and these entrepreneurs and help them to accelerate their growth. So there's a lot to be gained from just being part of the community, and that can be as easy as subscribing to the newsletter. Sure. And it can be or attending events, or it can be as much as entrepreneur boot camps or the Mira Awards and things like this that could help them to get key education, create key mentor or investor relationships, or get the kind of visibility and promotional horsepower behind them that they need to help them get their company off the ground.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.